Circumstances off the field have led many MLB seasons to have delays and outright cancellations, and perhaps the weirdest circumstances came in the 1981 season, a season that had to be split as a result of the players' strike leading to expanded playoffs and controversy in a season full of emerging stars. So let's look at that strange 1981 season.
Totally sports-esque. Major League.
After the Phillies won their first ever World Series in 1980, the biggest move of the offseason was made by George Steinbrenner when he made Dave Winfield the highest paid player in the game with a 10-year, $23 million contract, one that would later lead to issues between him and Steinbrenner as he thought he was signing him for $16 million, and a deal that was also a vocal point for future labor problems, as at the time, what the Padres would get for compensation was a draft pick, and the Padres and everyone else knew that was not enough. And compensation for lost free agents would become an issue from the get-go, as talks of a strike also became an issue from the start as the deadline was set for late May. And it's never a good sign when players are openly saying they were already ready to strike. Regardless, the season opened on April 9th, one day before Carlton Fisk switched socks and hit a 3-run home run at Fenway. And the biggest development from April 9th and what would be in the 1981 season is that the Dodgers' Jerry Royce pulled a muscle, not allowing him to start on opening day. And in his place would be rookie Fernando Valenzuela, who would end up making the start. Valenzuela debuted in September of 1980 and came out of the bullpen, pitching 17 2/3 of scoreless ball over 10 games. And things would be the same on opening day, as he fired a 5-hit complete game shutout against their division rival in the Houston Astros, to win 2-0, and that would be the beginning of what became known as Fernando Mania. He captivated the United States and his home nation of Mexico quickly, as through April, he made 5 starts, winning each one, with 4 of those being complete game shutouts, while putting up an insane .2 ERA. And the Dodgers fed off the energy as they won 26 of their first 35, leading the NL West from day one. And on the other side, there was also an AL West team that had the lead from day one, and that was the Oakland A's. Billy Martin became manager the year prior and helped turn around a team that won just 54 games in 1979. They implemented an aggressive, powerful style that became known as Billy Ball, aided with the likes of Dwayne Murphy and Rickey Henderson, who stole over 100 bases the year prior, along with a rotation that basically pitched every inning. And they started out 1981 by making history, by winning their first 11 games, the modern record at the time, that will be broke the next year by the Braves and later tied by the '87 Brewers and 2023 Rays. They would end up winning 20 of the first 23 for a sizable lead in the AL West. And another surprise was seen in the NL East, as a team leading through much of May was the Cardinals. Another team that, just like the A's, implemented a fast, aggressive style of play that would also be named after the manager, becoming known as Whitey Ball. But they would lose their lead by the end of May, as the defending champions took their place, while the Cardinals and Expos sat behind. And in the AL East, the Yankees would leapfrog 3 teams to take the division lead after winning their first 9 games of June. Meanwhile, the Reds won the first 7 games of June to cut the Dodgers' NL West lead down to just half a game. And the Rangers cut the A's lead to just 1.5 after the A's cooled down after their hot start. One day after Pete Rose would record his 3,630th hit to tie Stan Musial for the most hits in National League history, the division leaders were the Yankees and A's in the AL, while the Phillies and Dodgers led in the NL. And that would be important later, as on June 11th, the owners and the players' union had a meeting, and the next day, Union Chief Marvin Miller said, "We have accomplished nothing. The strike is on." It was a sad sight, as for the first time in MLB history, it looked like there wasn't going to be baseball during the summer. Some past MLB seasons had been shortened, such as the 1918 season ending a few weeks early, as a result of the prequel to World War II, and the first ever player strike occurred in 1972, which canceled the first 2 weeks of the season. But the midsummer, when there's nothing but baseball on, had never been impacted. And that 1972 strike came about over disagreements players had with owners over increasing pension payouts to track with inflation, when the players won in just 13 days. A sure sign that the 70s were a time where the power was shifting towards the players, a shift that was brought upon in main part thanks to Curt Flood, whose rejection of a trade in 1969 and later unsuccessful appeal to the Supreme Court went a very long way in the introduction of the reserve clause and free agency. And in 1981, free agency was only 6 years old. And as already mentioned, teams, especially small market teams, felt that they were not being properly compensated for their losses. From 78 to 81, 43 players signed contracts over $1 million. And part of the reason owners were dishing out large contracts is they were afraid of losing their top players to the free agent re-entry draft, a system that didn't last long and allowed teams to select players in which they wished to enter negotiations with in a way to prevent certain teams from signing a ton of free agents. Players strongly expressed that any monetary compensation would diminish the purpose of free agency, while owners told the players that they didn't have any more money, as all players' salaries were rising, with arbitrators usually siding with the players. Obviously, the owners did have more money, as will be seen with future players' salaries, but both sides were divided, with the media and the fans blaming the owners for the situation, even though the players are the ones striking. And while the players and owners were subtweeting each other, fans resorted to watching simulated games using Stratomatic, and that includes the All-Star Game, which was displayed on the scoreboard in Cleveland Stadium. Other canceled games were simulated and reported in the newspaper, but they would no longer have to simulate games when 51 days after it started, the strike came to an end on July 31st. An interesting amount of time, as the owners had a 51-day strike insurance. That ended with a compromise that teams that lost a premium free agent would be compensated by drawing from a pool of players left unprotected from every team instead of just the team the free agent signed. Players also agreed to restrict free agency to players with at least 6 years of experience. A small victory for the owners that left the players so bitter that players rep Marvin Miller refused to pose with the owners' negotiator in the peace ceremony photo. And another issue that had to be solved is how the rest of the season would take shape. And the decision was to have a split season, meaning every team was basically 0-0. But the 4 division winners at the time of the strike were given automatic playoff berths, that being the Yankees, A's, Dodgers, and the Phillies. And the 4 division winners in the second half would face the first half division winners in what would become the first ever division series, expanding the playoffs from 4 teams to 8. Not a permanent decision, and if any of the first half division winners won the division again, whoever finished second would go to the playoffs. It was a decision that many agreed with, but also one that was criticized from the start. Many felt it cheapened the final results of the season, and it gave first half winners less incentive to win, which even players such as Tommy John at the Yankees noted, as he said they lost some of their firepower. Which makes sense, considering aside from just general pride in player awards, they were already in the playoffs. This system would cause problems later, but after nearly 2 months away, with 713 games, or 38% of the season being cancelled, resulting in a loss of $146 million, baseball was back with the All-Star Game on August 9th, marking the only time it was played on Sunday, and the second time it was played outside of July. A record 72,000 watched the NL win their 10th straight All-Star Game, as the aggravation from the strike was felt with the sharp decline in TV ratings. Pete Rose passed Sam Musial in hits after a 2-month wait as regular season play resumed. And what the second half meant was that everyone now had a chance. Teams like the Cardinals and Reds, who just missed out on winning the division in the first half, had new motivation, along with reasons to feel that they were in unfair circumstances. As for teams who were completely out of it in June, they now had a chance for redemption, and one of those was the defending AL champions in the Kansas City Royals. Unlike the A's, the Royals did not start out the season strong, going 9-22 and finishing the first half at 20-30. And a new slate was exactly what they needed. They were just above 500 for much of the second half, but got hot at the end, winning 6 of their final 8 to win the second half AL West. And even though they had a full season record of 50-53, which would have gave them a 4th place finish, 11 games behind the A's in the AL West, they were now in the playoffs. In the AL East, every team except the Blue Jays had a chance to win the division at the time of the strike, but the Yankees wouldn't have to fight in the second half. And the one who came out on top, in what would be a 4-team race, would be the Milwaukee Brewers. As Raleigh Fingers saved 16 of their 31 wins to give them their first ever playoff appearance. And once again, it's easier to point out the flaws in the system, as in the full season, the Yankees would not only have missed the playoffs, but would have finished 3rd. But that didn't matter, as they were still in. And the controversy would be worse in the National League. The surprise team of the year in the NL and the Cardinals were given a tough second half schedule, as nearly 60% of their games were on the road, and that would make a difference, as it was the Montreal Expos who beat them by half a game to win the second half NL East. And just like the Brewers, they were making the postseason for the first time, something that infuriated Whitey Herzog, as the Cardinals had the best overall record in the NL East. Herzog called it the dumbest decision he's ever seen in baseball, as he called it the Bowie Kuhn sweepstakes. And the only team that would end up more upset was the Cincinnati Reds. They already had the misfortune of having to battle with the Dodgers for the division crown. In the second half, they were battling again, along with 3 other teams. But the Astros were 1.5 better, as the Reds lost 3 of their last 4 games. And the reason this still upsets Reds fans is not only did they have the best overall record in the NL West, they had the best overall record in the entire league. And they weren't playing in the playoffs. As a way to honor what they did and peacefully protest the results, they carried a banner saying baseball's best record before their last game. Despite how upset the Cardinals and Reds were, their seasons were over, while 8 other teams were playing the largest MLB postseason ever at that point. There was still the usual awards given out, and history was made as Fernando Valenzuela became the only pitcher to win Rookie of the Year and Cy Young in the same year, as he just edged out Tim Raines for Rookie of the Year, and also edged out one of 7 pitchers who won Cy Young and Rookie of the Year, and Tom Seaver to win the Cy Young. In a year he ended up pitching the most games and innings, with 11 of his 25 starts being complete games, and 8 of those being shutouts, both league leading, as he also led all pitchers in strikeouts in WAR. He also hit .250 with a low strikeout rate to win the Silver Slugger. He would also finish 5th in MVP voting, behind Mike Schmidt, who just edged out Andre Dawson. As for the AL, Dave Righetti would take home Rookie of the Year, while Raleigh Fingers won the Cy Young and MVP, becoming the first reliever to win the MVP. And I think recency bias did a lot for Fingers here, as he was locked down for the Brewers in the second half with a .72 ERA and 37.2 innings, and saving over half of their games. He probably deserved the Cy Young, but in my opinion, I don't think he deserved MVP over Ricky Henderson. Henderson led in a number of categories, including a wide gap in stolen bases of course, and he was the most important player on the A's, who were able to play their style because of him, and able to not be too concerned about final results in the second half because of him. And the fact that Raleigh Fingers was a closer who pitched just 1 or 2 innings makes it harder to justify his win, though Willie Hernandez in '84 and Dennis Eckersley in '92 would also win the MVP. I think it was really the recency bias that went the longest way for him. Regardless, the first ever division series was underway after controversy, and the predetermined schedule called for the second half winners to get the first 2 games at home, while the first half winners got the last 3. Had there been a team who won the first and second half, they would have got every game at home except Game 1. And for the first team to ever make the playoffs with a below .500 record, in the Royals, they did not take advantage of their home field advantage as they lost 2 at home, scoring just 1 run in those 2 games. And Game 3 would take place in Oakland, in the only stadium that saw attendance rise on a per-game basis in 1981. And they would continue to shut down the Kansas City offense, as Rick Langford gave up just 1, despite giving up 10 hits, as the A's won 4-1 to win the first playoff series since they won their 3rd straight World Series in 1974. And the other ALDS between the Brewers and the Yankees, the Brewers also could not take advantage of their home field advantage, as they lost both games. But the Yankees couldn't take advantage of theirs either, as they lost Game 3 and 4 to set up a decisive Game 5, as the Brewers looked to be the first team to come back from a 2-0 deficit after losing the first 2 home games. And things looked good, as they were up 2-0 after the 3rd. But Reggie Jackson and Oscar Gamble would hit back-to-back home runs in the 4th, as the Yankees scored 4 runs that inning, which would be the difference, as they ruined the Brewers' first playoff experience. And while teams in the AL had a hard time taking advantage of their home field, the NL teams did not, as the NL West matchup gave a preview of the 2017 World Series without the bang, as the Astros went up against the Dodgers. In Game 1, Nolan Ryan and Fernando Valenzuela both pitched gems, as Alan Ashby hit a walk-off home run. Then the next night, Denny Walling hit a walk-off single in the 11th to put the Astros up 2-0. But the Dodgers would respond at home, winning Game 3 convincingly. Then on short rest, Valenzuela would throw a complete game in Game 4, giving up just 1 run, with 2 outs in the 9th to win 2-1, and set up a Game 5. And in that Game 5, Nolan Ryan went up against Jerry Royce, who was excellent again, just like Game 2. While the Dodgers took advantage of 6-inning errors and walks from the man who broke the record for most career walks earlier that year, as they won 4-0 with a Royce complete game, avenging the Astros who beat them in a 1-game playoff in 1980. And the other NLDS was nearly identical. The Expos won the first ever postseason game played outside of the US, and they won the second, to put the defending World Series champs on the ropes. But just like the Dodgers, the Phillies responded at home, winning Game 3 6-2, then in Game 4, things went to extras tied at 5, and George Vukovich would lead off the bottom of the 10th with a walk-off home run to set up for the 3rd Game 5. And it was a battle of the Steves, with Steve Rogers going for the Expos and Steve Carlton going for the Phillies. And it was Rogers who was the better Steve, as just like Royce, he would throw a complete game shutout, as the Expos won 3-0 for the first international playoff series win, also making them the only second-half division winners to advance. And that meant for the first time since 1973, there wasn't a Pennsylvania team in the NLCS. It would again be a 5-game series, only this time the Expos got the final 3 games at home. And this time the Dodgers split, winning the first and giving Valenzuela no run support in Game 2 as they lost 3-0. And the first ever LCS game in Canada, Game 5 hero Steve Rogers was on the mound, and he was great again, giving up just 1 in another complete game, as a 3-run Jerry White home run would be the difference, putting the Expos 1 run away from a Canadian World Series game. And in Game 4, things were 1-1 from the 4th to the 7th, but the Dodgers scored 6 in the final 2 innings to set up another Game 5. And it was a great pitching matchup, as the Rookie of the Year in the Cy Young and Fernando Valenzuela was on the mound for the Dodgers, and Ray Burris was going for the Expos. And the game was delayed because of a snowout the day prior. And as expected, both pitchers dominated, both giving up 1 through 8, as Burris was pinch hit for in the 8th, with the Expos bringing in Steve Rogers in the 9th, pitching on short rest, and again looking to be a Game 5 hero. He got the first 2 out, and up came the first ever #1 overall pick in Rick Monday, And on a Monday, he became a Dodgers legend by hitting a solo home run to put them up by 1. The Expos weren't completely out of it though, when they recorded a few 2-out walks, causing Bob Welch to relieve Valenzuela, and he would get the final out to give the Dodgers their 3rd pennant in the last 5 seasons. On the other side, it was devastation for the Expos who were so close, and a date that would become known as Blue Monday. Because it was a Monday hit a home run, and it made Expos fans feel blue. And the reason it came to hurt even more in the end is the Expos would never make the playoffs again, before they moved to Washington, D.C. In fact, it was so painful that the following year, Rick Monday was asked to leave a Montreal restaurant as 6 patrons were trying to fight him. Meanwhile, in the ALCS, there was a more exciting premise, as Billy Martin was going against both his former and future team, the Yankees, but it wasn't near as good, as the Yankees swept the A's in 3, outscoring them 20-4 to set up the 3rd Dodgers-Yankees World Series in the last 5 seasons. And in the World Series, the Dodgers were quickly in familiar territory, as they lost the first 2 games on the road in New York, even with Reggie Jackson injured. He was cleared to play for Game 3 in LA, but George Steinbrenner ordered Bob Lemon to sit him, and once again, Valenzuela was on the mound in Game 3, and again, he threw a complete game. It wasn't exactly smooth sailing, as he would give up 9 hits, 2 of those home runs, he would also walk 7, face 40 batters, and throw 149 pitches. But he went the distance to give the Dodgers a 5-4 win and end the Yankees' 6-game win streak. Reggie Jackson returned for Game 4, and it was a slugfest. The Dodgers came back from a 4-run deficit, tying things at 6 in the 6th. Then they took the lead in the 7th with 2 runs, which would be the difference, as they won 8-7. Game 5 would be the opposite. Jerry Royce was on the mound, and he went up against Ron Guidry. The Yankees scored 1 in the 2nd, which would be all the scoring until the 7th, when Pedro Guerrero and Steve Yeager hit back-to-back home runs, which would be the difference, as the Dodgers were now up 3-2 in the series. There was a rain delay before Game 6, meaning the October 20th Game 6 was the latest World Series game of all time. This also allowed Tommy John to start against Bert Hooton. It was 1-1 after the 4th, when Bob Lemon made the predetermined decision to pull John and go with his bullpen, which would be a mistake. The Dodgers scored 7 runs over the 5th and the 6th, aided by an errant Dave Winfield throw on wet grass, not helping that he went 1 for 22 in the series. And it was essentially over after that, as both teams tacked on another, as the Dodgers would end up winning 9-2 to finally top the Yankees and win their 5th World Series, and officially put an end to a strange, controversial, and memorable 1981 season. Things went back to normal after the season, in the sense of the 4-team playoff format returning, and obviously there wasn't another split season. But this season did have a long-term effect, and it was felt just recently. There's 2 seasons this one compares to, the first being 1994. Of course, that brought the longest strike in MLB history, and the most devastating in terms of impact. Tons of fans were lost, especially in comparison to the loss felt in 1981, and a big reason for that is the season never returned, and for the first time since 1904, a World Series was not played. And when things did return, a little later in 1995, an idea they took from the 1981 season was postseason expansion. As from 1995 and on, there would be 2 division series in each league with the addition of the wild card. This was actually supposed to be implemented in 94 with the new 3-division format, but obviously it never happened. And one thing you can say in looking back at these 2 years is how painful both years were for Expos fans. The 1981 strike was actually kind of good for them, as they wouldn't have made the playoffs without the new rules. But the final result was devastating, and many fans acknowledged that Monday's home run went a long way in the franchise's eventual exit. But nothing was more painful than the 1994 season. The best team by record, and from just the eye test when things came to a halt in 1994, was the Montreal Expos. The only team close to them in the league was the Yankees, whose 70 wins were still 4 less than the Expos. Behind those 2 were the Braves, who were still 6 games back of the Expos. Obviously, you never know what may have happened, but the Expos were bound to make their 2nd playoff appearance and would have been favorites to win the pennant. But it never came to be, and the franchise as a whole unfortunately never recovered, as their fans and Bryce Harper watched the Nationals win the World Series in 2019 with heavy hearts. And the season 1981 is definitely the most similar to is the great season of 2020. The big difference here being that it was true outside factors that caused the strange 2020 season, while 1981 was brought upon by a strike. Teams played 52 or 53 games in the second half in 1981, while they played 60 in 2020, with the biggest difference being there were no fans in the stands in 2020. And just like 81, there was postseason expansion in 2020. Only this time, 16 teams were in the playoffs, so both times, the amount of playoff teams doubled. Perhaps it was that both years brought unique circumstances that Major League Baseball decided to get experimental. And both times, it was the best regular season teams making the World Series. And of course, The glaring similarity in the end was the Dodgers winning the World Series in both of these years, as the Dodgers seemed to thrive in chaos and less games, and managers pulling their starters early in a Game 6. The 1981 season was a season like no other, and one that had a long-term effect, as though it wasn't too drastic. Major League Baseball did not learn their lesson in time for the massive impact the 94 strike had. The 81 season brought the rise of new stars, new teams, disappointments, and long-awaited triumph. And thankfully, both 1981 and 2020 were able to resume to give us apologies from the commissioner, George Steinbrenner, in regards to his players, and from certain announcers.
I pride myself and think of myself as a man of